Hello.
Hi, Bailey. Hi, everyone.
Yeah, hi, everybody. Welcome to the Toolkits Graphic Narratives Live in Conversation. We'll be having a conversation with David Golding tonight. My name's Bailey Sharp. I'll be facilitating the session today. I'm calling in from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I know our guest, David, tonight is on Wurundjeri country. And that many, if not all of us in the session today are sitting on stolen Indigenous lands across this continent. So to start off, on behalf of everybody here, I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and to any First Nations people watching today's discussion. So this is the first of two conversations that we're going to host this week with people involved in Australian comics. Tonight we have the privilege of talking to David Golding, who is a senior editor at Scribe Publications. David has over a decade's experience in publishing, editing both fiction and nonfiction, and is responsible for building Scribe's comics list, which is, I think, a really great development for the Australian comic scene. Tomorrow, at the same time, we're going to have another live talk with Meg O'Shea, who's a cartoonist and researcher living and working on Gadigal land. And before we get into the actual conversation, I just give a bit of context. So I'm the facilitator of this season of the graphic narratives stream of the Toolkits program. My background, I'm a cartoonist myself. I come from kind of a zine making and self-publishing background, and I've been teaching comics and sort of other related courses at universities over the last 7 years. I'm also a co-administrator of Glom Press, which is a risograph comics publisher and for hire printer that's located in Narm. And I think David and I haven't met before today, but I'm very interested in this conversation because I think we both have similar goals in our publishing practices towards building out this scene in this country. And if you don't already know, this live talk is for Toolkits Connect, which is a 12-week program for writers aged 30 and under to help develop their skills in a unique and exciting online environment. So Toolkits is run by Express Media. Express has been around for over 30 years, and they develop, support, and promote young writers through workshops that develop skills, like the ones that we're doing week by week in this 12-week program, and through opportunities for constructive feedback and publication. They have their flagship publication, VoiceWorks, which is a great youth-led project and magazine. If you haven't seen it already, I highly recommend. And through awards and programs that recognize excellence. Toolkits Connect is generously supported by the Copyright Cultural Fund. This session will be available on YouTube as a resource after this talk finishes, and it'll be captioned in the coming days. If you want to ask any questions, you can do so via the live chat section on YouTube. So feel free, comment anytime. We'll probably let those questions kind of add up, and then we'll shift into the Q&A towards the end of the hour. So just to start, hello, David.
Hi. Oh, sorry.
I just said, how are you?
Oh, yeah. No, good, thank you. I'm sorry, the audio just dropped out there for a second. But yeah, no, it's good. Having a lovely sunny day here. And yeah, I'm in the office and yeah, just in Brunswick. And
yeah, cool. Well, I was going to ask you to start about Scribe a little bit. Like maybe it's worth going over a little potted history of who Scribe is and kind of the scale of Scribe publishing.
Sure. So Scribe's we call ourselves a small independent publisher. It was founded by Henry Rosenblum in 1976 and has sort of been publishing books at I guess a bigger, more substantial scale since the turn of the century. I've been here for almost 13 years. And yeah, so we've got about 20 people here in the Melbourne office, and in the last decade we've also expanded out so that we've got an office in London as well with 7 people in it, and we also publish books in the US with a small team of people over there. But here in Brunswick is basically where most of it is sort of happening. And yeah, we're in terms of production and design and you know, the kind of infrastructure of the company. We publish about 65 books a year. We also have a children's imprint, Scribble, that does about half a dozen books a year. And about half of those books are ones that we originate ourselves. And about half the ones that we've bought rights for. Some of them are in English language, so we're just republishing them in our territories. And half of those are ones that have been published in other languages in Europe or Asia, for instance. And we you know, work for a translator to translate them and publish them in English language. So yeah, that's kind of the sort of thing we do. We're sort of known for, I guess, you know, serious nonfiction very well, and you know, we got you know, some of our bigger books are sort of popular science books like The Brain That Changes Itself or Gut by Julia Enders, and we also recently, you know, sort of Nikki Savva's political trilogy about the Liberal Party in the last decade, you know, Road to Ruin, Plots and Prayers, and Bulldozed. But we, you know, we also have, you know, fairly good track record with you know, sort of Australian fiction as well. You know, I think we've got 2 Age Book of the Year winners, 2 Victorian Premier's Award Literary Award winners. You know, most recently, The Animals in That Country by Laura Jean McKay, which is, you know, fantastic novel. Yeah, and also, you know, some really big kids books like All the Ways to Be Smart by Davina Bell and Alison Colpoys, which is like a fantastic, you know, picture book for parents and children alike, I think. Yeah, so that's I guess sort of the sketch of us.
Yeah, and you're, from my understanding, you're instrumental in the kind of newer push to include, you know, graphic novels or comics. I don't know which term you prefer, but I guess I was wondering what, yeah, like what that kind of, what made you advocate for comics?
Yeah, well, I guess, you know, really, I love comics. You know, I've read comics as long as I've been reading. You know, one of the earliest books I can remember reading is Fungus the Bogeyman by Raymond Briggs. And, you know, and I continued reading through my teenage years and somehow, you know, continue reading as an adult, which I think a lot of people sort of stop at some point in their late teens, but, you know, kept reading them. And I guess, you know, I saw so much talent out there in Australia doing things, often in zines or doing work for like SBS or ABC. And, you know, it sort of came around that I saw work that I thought, you know, this is work that if it were turned into a book, you know, would fit with the kind of books that we have already got a track record of doing, that we sort of know a bit about how to publish. And I guess, you know, through my many years of reading comics and sort of discussing comics with people and reading, you know, even nonfiction about comics, you know, I sort of thought I had enough knowledge that I could do an okay job of editing them as well. So that, you know, with someone I could help produce it before we published it. So yeah, so I guess that's it. You know, my sort of love for it and my sort of thought that we could do it. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think from my perspective, I've lived in Australia for about 12 years now, and like I've seen it massively kind of open up and change in terms of like the Australian comics scene. And I think I'm so glad to see publishers like Scribe taking on comics, because I think there was this huge gap that is maybe starting to get filled now, where some of the most prominent cartoonists in Australia would go overseas. I'm thinking of like Lee Lai, Tommy Parrish, Simon Hanselman, like, and maybe I thought, you know, they had their, you know, myriad of reasons, but I thought also there was this kind of vacuum here where it felt like there kind of wasn't like a bigger tier publisher that was really interested in the kinds of comics, particularly that they were making, that they could like, you know, escalate and give their work to. So I'm super glad that it's heading in this direction. So thank you for your efforts at spearheading that. I thought maybe it would be kind of illuminating to hear if maybe there was a particular book that you've worked on and edited, like hear what that process has been like from start to finish. Like where does it kind of originate, and when are you doing the editorial work, and how does it sort of finish up?
Yeah. Yeah. So, so we've published 5 graphic novels, and you can sort of arrange them conveniently behind my head. And we've got more in the works, and in particular this month 2 have gone to press. But I'm going to talk about let's see if I can get my finger right. Ooh, this one. Sam Warman's book there, Our Members Be Unlimited, which has a sort of interesting story, and it was the first book.
So your baby is that
we sort of acquired, and it's, I guess, the sort of the template for how we've been going about doing all this sort of things. Sort of we established everything there. So so Scribe had been publishing sort of books of political cartoons for many years. So you can see this one. This is the first one we did in 2003. Best Australian Political Cartoons 2023 is out now, so you can get that for Christmas. But we've been doing these sort of books of cartoons for many years, and I'd sort of seen Sam Woolman around doing these amazing sort of online comics, using sort of infinite scroll kind of not infinite, but long vertical scrolling sort of comics that you could do online. And sort of amazing artwork where these objects would sort of transform into people, and then the people would sort of transform into landscapes, and this amazing sort of fluidity of what it is to be a being in the world. That was, I found, very sort of humane kind of art, but really at the same time, funny and rude and clever, and so I was really liking that sort of thing. On the back of those sort of political cartoons, we did this book, What Happened to the Car Industry, which was basically a long essay, punctuated with political cartoons about all those kind of events that had gone on to the point where we're closing all the car factories in Geelong. And so Sam did let's see if I can hold this near the screen and it could be visible, did this amazing sort of comic that was also related to this, and quoted parts of our book at points. And I guess that was kind of an impetus of me sort of thinking, oh, he's not just this really talented and interesting sort of politics there and things like that, but here he is explicitly referencing and working with a book that we had published, and sort of clicked of going, oh, maybe he would be interested in doing a book for us that could be really worthwhile. So kind of mid to late 2016, I sent out an email to him sort of saying, hey, you want to catch up and chat and maybe talk about something like this? And he's like, sorry, he was in the United States doing political cartoons for SBS, among others, covering the sort of Trump, Hillary Clinton sort of election, and sort of doing these little portraits of things going on around America at the time. So 2017 came around and we did meet up for a coffee, and he sounded keen, and I guess we basically signed him up for an idea which was pretty much take some of these existing works that he'd done, take them out of that sort of vertical scrolling and reformat them for the page, and put in some linking material that would sort of make it into a coherent piece about unions. And, so it's sort of about maybe 50% new material, maybe less, and a lot of existing material, black and white, 112 pages. And then the book became very different to that, to anyone who's seen it. We're sort of working along, sort of like working out, like, well, how do we do this? I've got to say, a lot of the time, books come to us in fairly developed forms, either as either as complete manuscripts, often in the case of fiction, or as having sample chapters and a substantial outline in the case of nonfiction. So it's relatively rare that we go out and sort of say to someone, "Hey, have you got a book in you?" In this case, I think the basis of the work I'd seen was sort of encouraging. So so we were sort of feeling through all that together of like, well, what do you want to do first? Do you want to write, and we sort of worked it out. Well, you'll do an outline, and then you'll write some bits of script, and then you'll write a full script, and then I'll edit the script, and then you can do some roughs that sort of, thumbnail sort of images, breaking down the pages, and then once that's sort of edited and agreed to, then you can start on the finished artwork. And obviously a lot of that would have been a matter of like, how does Sam, position existing material? And I think that year, sort of end of 2017, he went off to the Comic Arts Workshop, which is this fantastic arts residency that in Australia. I think it runs for about 2 weeks, where maybe a dozen creators go off together and sort of intensively work through a graphic novel idea.
I just jumped in to say that Meg O'Shea, our speaker for tomorrow, is actually she's just become one of the 2 co-leads on CAW, is the acronym, Comics Art Workshop. So I will definitely be asking her, plug for tomorrow, I'll be asking her more about CAW, because I agree it's a really great place to do this kind of workshopping of these longer pieces that are so hard, I think, to workshop and talk about and think about in comics.
Yeah, so I think that workshop, I think like 6 books have already come out of that and been published since 2017, and I know there's at least 2 more coming in the next year or so. So that's just that one residency. So that's
pretty sort of wild, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think anyone who's ever done that kind of intensive residency just knows just how amazingly fertile they can be when run well. And obviously that one, they went to Yogyakarta in Indonesia, and sounds like it was good. So I remember talking to Sam before he went away, and we sort of had some ideas. I think things were starting to shift a bit about what the kind of book was going to be. And I think after he come back, it really was sort of shifted into this idea of like, no, it's going to be an original graphic novel, all new material, color, probably twice the length of what we were sort of talking about. Sam started, he sort of, got a high level sort of about 10 chapter ideas, sort of, ideas for 10 chapters that sound, that would sort of, some of it was an email, some of it was sort of meeting up for coffee and sort of, just talking through things. And that sounded good to me. And he sort of started putting together these sort of treatments of, breaking it down into like, what's a single sentence summary of this chapter? What's a paragraph summary? What's the tone going to be? What's some quotes and events that I can stick into this chapter? And here's some sketches that indicate what kind of things might be in the chapter. What some images I want to use. So very, again, this sort of rich creative process of Sam sort of imagining this book into life from putting it in a very different state to where it started from.
Can I ask, based on that, how did you deliver feedback? Was it mostly like printouts with notes and things? Was it conversations? Like how do you go about giving feedback on, particularly, you know, once it's on a visual, you know, he's got some kind of rough for the visual component. Like, how are you sort of feedbacking on that?
Yeah, so it's different at different stages, and I guess, you know, in those early formative times, it was almost entirely verbal feedback, and you know, partly that was because, you know, lots of things were coming out of Sam's head, and you know, I wanted to be able to respond dynamically, but also not just like, you know, pin things down at that point. Once we'd sort of got those sort of ideas, you know, we sort of moved to creating, you know, he did write the full script at that point. And then once I had that script, you know, I was writing emails, you know, sort of writing a long letter of sort of, you know, about some of the bigger points, you know, kind of structural suggestions, talking about like, I'm not sure that this particular part works, and you know, what's going on here? Could we tease this out, for instance? But also putting in sort of just little comments, you know, on the document itself, using, you know, kind of track changes to sort of say, you know, this line here doesn't work for me, or this line here is amazing, this is so good. You know, and then sort of you know, maybe putting some points about like, oh, could we connect these things, or, you know, so yeah, so at that point you're sort of moving into you know, putting down comments, you know, in writing. And then yeah, but then it's sort of like going on to sort of thumbnail, you know, doing the layouts of every single page. And you know, some of those, you know, you were sort of we're talking about you know, kind of got 2 pages here, and just sort of like trying to break it down. It's like, you know, these are pages that are going to be a big sort of splashy sort of page. You know, this is a page that's going to have like, you know, very dense kind of thing. You know, some of them are very, very sketchy. Some of them are very detailed, sort of depending on how much, I guess, Sam felt he needed to sort of work through that. Yeah, and at that point, you know, again, you know, sort of thinking, obviously this is sort of rough, but, you know, particularly thinking about flow, I guess, at that point, and like, you know, how does this flow visually? You know, do I feel like, you know, the book's sort of making sense from page to page, and, you know, and from chapter to chapter, and sort of, you know, those sort of structures. Probably again at that point, you know, sort of moving into sort of more dynamic verbal feedback and things like that.
Yeah, and I would say, particularly if anybody's not familiar with Sam's work and this book, you know, he's very, you know, sometimes he'll have some panels in there, but he really pushes, you know, structure, I think, in really interesting ways. Like, there's a lot of, you know, things happening across pages, and, you know, text being woven into these kinds of larger scale images in really dynamic and interesting, fun ways for me as a reader. But I also imagine, like, you know, this terribly complex to like kind of map it all out and think about it.
Yeah, yeah, and obviously, like in March 2020, we sort of had this meeting, and we sort of jokingly bumped elbows, and, you know, I remember making a joke about like, ha ha ha, you know, you're going to America later this year. It's like, ooh, what if travel restrictions come in? Ha 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 ha. Anyway, turned out that wasn't that funny in the end. So it was a bit of a crazy sort of period then going on, and but you know, one of my delights during that period is, you know, to sort of drive himself. Sam had this kind of like, you know, I'm going to text you a page every day to make himself, you know, commit to like, you know, doing that page every day. And, you know, and that was really lovely. And, you know, sort of nice connection that I think we had during that period of, you know, and at that point that was sort of mostly like not providing feedback, because like, you know, he needed to have that momentum and to keep forward producing those pages. And so if I was going to jump in and sort of say, oh, something about the color or this figure on this page, you know, then he'd be stopping on that and sort of working on it. So it was sort of really, you know, an encouragement phase, getting momentum going, producing the pages, and you know, it was sort of nice. And then at the end of it, you know, sort of saving up ideas and things, because obviously, you know, as any artist will, you know, you'll be putting things down, but you yourself will be thinking, I'm going to come back to that and change it. Or by the time you get to the end of it, you're no longer happy with what you started with. And so, there was that aspect as well, that there's not that much point in me necessarily giving detailed feedback to things that might change anyway. But yeah, and I guess, the final thing in terms of once you sort of got into those sort of final art, it really was a matter of me getting open a Word document and saying, page 22, row 3, panel 6, this speech balloon needs this change or something, and sort of, really detailed kind of things, because it's it's hard to mark up printed pages that have so much ink on them. It's hard to use PDFs. In a case of a book like this, like you say, some pages layouts are very creative, so it wasn't always easy to say this panel or anything as straightforward as that. Sometimes it's like this bit of text that goes around in a spiral, and you just quote a bit of the text. And obviously, again, when you're working with pros as well, you can directly change text within, say, Microsoft Word, but with comics, obviously, I say something to Sam actually has to go and change the art itself and then come back to me. I can't sort of directly intervene as an editor in the same way that is sometimes possible with just prose. So so there's the one book project had so many different ways of working on different things. Towards the end of it, Sam's like, I've got this idea for this wraparound cover, and I'm like, I'm not really sure that's going to work. So he sort of drew up some pieces, and so then I printed it out and sort of got the whole does this actually make sense as a wraparound concept for a cover, and then going to our production manager and going, can we have a wraparound cover as well? And for those people who haven't seen it, we did in fact get our amazing sort of wraparound cover that sort of goes around and around and around. Anyway, so yeah, I mean, there were so many different ways of working with the book and working with Sam on that particular one. But I think that's kind of, just emblematic of, I mean, all books end up being edited differently. You work with different authors differently, but also different books with the same author, end up being sort of different processes. It's just, it's that excitement of part of the job of, kind of meeting of minds with the author and sort of finding a path forward together,
Yeah, and to that point, I think you've mentioned this sort of loosely started around 2017, was that right? And it came out last year.
Yeah. So we signed him up at the start of 2017. We got the final files. We sent it off to print in November 2021. And then, we sort of saw some early things, but we didn't get the first, even though we sent it off at the start of November, we get the first everything color printing in Australia, and indeed in lots of parts of the world, gets printed in Asia, usually China. And, they have these, big, amazing print plants that can do color and different formats, much more economically than can be done here without, huge investments of money. So then, because it's printed over there, it's got to get on a ship and come here, which is a lot slower than getting up on a truck from Adelaide, which is where most of our prose books are printed. So it was, we sent off to print it in November. We got the first physical finished books flown to us in mid-January, and then the rest of the stock on the boat, came sort of mid-February. And that's sort of, again, the nature of comics, we actually print them a bit earlier than we would other books, because we want to be able to hand them to our sales reps who go out to booksellers and be able to show them an actual book, so they've got an idea about what they're talking about. Because there are much fewer comics published in Australia, you sort of want to give more of an idea to these people about, what is this book going to be like? What does it actually look like and feel like in your hand? What's it really about? And then this book, because it was about unions and terrifically excellent book about unions. As we're approaching that publication date in May 2022, unions got interested and started pre-ordering quantities of it. And so then as it approached our publication date, we realized that we were going to be out of stock in the warehouse on publication date, because the unions had sort of bought up all these copies, which is lovely, a lovely problem to have, but we needed to reprint, and it meant everything gets on the ship again. And it took time to sort of actually then get back into our warehouse and be able to feed it out into shops. But that was
I imagine reprinting at that scale, I mean, in terms of that scale of book, is much trickier than maybe reprints of prose, or am I wrong? I would think.
No, the printing process itself, I think, is probably pretty similar. Once everything's ready, it's probably pretty similar. It's just the fact that it's overseas that makes the real difference there. Anyway, so it was like 5 years from when we acquired it to when it was published on bookshelves. It was sort of 5 years. So it was a long sort of process for all of these different parts. I think it's an amazing book, and it's gotten a few short lists of sort of Premier's Awards and other sort of awards that I think it's interesting to at least have crossed over to get that sort of attention, which rarely happens. I think it's fantastic work from Sam.
If anybody hasn't checked it out, I would highly recommend it. And I think that notion of comics just starting to cross over and win these accolades that are normally reserved for prose, I think there are really interesting things happening there, and I'm hoping that leads to maybe more publishers, maybe just more money and interest and investment in comics. To Sarah's question, she had a question in the midst of that conversation, which is, for a project like this, what's a typical timeline, or is it really dependent on the author? Like, do you think that 5 years is?
Yeah, it's going to be really dependent as well. I mean, because some of these books, like my other side, Flick over here is a French graphic novel, and so that already existed in France. The files existed. What needed to happen was for us to get it translated, and a few little pieces sort of adapted for our market. But so that sort of is then a very different sort of proposition. And the same, on the first one, hypercapitalism. We just bought files for that from an American publisher, and again, so it was all sort of that long lead up process was sort of done. We sort of acquired the files, pretty much sent it off to print, and published it sort of with a bit of time after that. So so it can be quite quick in some circumstances. Other circumstances it's going to be slower. Sam's got a second book coming out with written by Jeff Sparrow and drawn by Sam, coming out next year, and that's been a much faster process of sort of creating that book. So it's all sort of different. And like that question Sarah's asked about billing for the time. I mean, I'm an employee of Scribe, so I'm just paid for being a full-time employee. And in terms of obviously we're trying to manage my workload and try to be able to be available for as many books as possible, so I don't just spend a year working on one book and not work on any other books. But that's kind of how long is a piece of string question as well. You sort of, some books do end up having a lot more time spent with them than others. Sam's book, even though it sort of had a long elapsed time, a lot of that was small pieces of work along the way, so it sort of didn't feel like a huge project on my end. So it's all sort of really different, I guess.
I was going to ask what a typical day maybe looks like for you, or a typical week, if that's easier to answer. Like, sort of, do you have lots of projects on the boil and you're kind of dipping in and out of them? Is that?
Yeah, I mean, I have maybe about a dozen books actually that I'm currently sort of in various stages. I mean, some of those are basically, in the final kind of print checks, going off sort of stages, and other ones are at the, very early sort of, structural notes sort of stage. But, so it's not like 12 books all of the same amount of work that I'm working on at the same time. But like, they do tend to have a lot of overlap of different projects, and, you have to sort of manage your time around that. And I'm doing other things as well as editing. But yeah, I guess, ideally on any given day, I'll be sitting down with a manuscript. Maybe if it's early on in the process, I'll be reading it, making high-level notes for myself or possibly for the author. And probably, the bulk of my time throughout the year, the activity I'm doing more than anything else is sitting there with pages of a manuscript and sort of going through it at a fine level, and sort of like saying, how does this sentence or comics panel or whatever, how does it read? Does it sort of, sing, or, is it sort of flat? Does it make sense? Is it consistent with what's gone before or what I know was coming afterwards? Are there sort of facts or legal issues that I need to be sort of mindful of in this part? How's the spelling? How's the grammar? In a comic, how's the coloring or the line work? All those sort of, so just really sort of a lot of time, spent looking at things at a really close level. And, that's kind of like the heart of the author-editor relationship, is that, you will be, the author themselves. It's not unusual for an author to spend years on any kind of work, whether it's a comic or prose work. And then, they've put a lot of work and heart and thought and everything into this. And that you are reading it so carefully and so closely, I guess, is, that really goes to the heart of how you build trust in that relationship. Yeah. And then, checking all those things and then marking it up, whether that's in track changes in Word or writing a letter to someone, or writing up notes for them, or in some cases, using a gold Sharpie to draw on printed artwork. Yeah, just doing whatever you can to sort of, get that feedback then if you think that something needs to change or something needs to happen to a character, or just a word needs to be spelled differently, things like that. So yeah, that's kind of like the real heart of the day-to-day job.
I was wondering, kind of related to that, because you mentioned obviously you approached Sam for that book, but what would the ideal, if you were to get a manuscript for a comic, like what's the ideal stage in your opinion for that to be at? Is it still fairly loose, or is it something that's maybe more like the nonfiction pieces that have maybe a sample chapter and then an outline? What do you sort of look for?
I think it's really going to depend. I mean, obviously if a book comes in and it's completely drawn and finished and sort of, almost ready to print on its own right, and I don't like it, or it's not the kind of book we're going to publish, then we're just going to pass on that. That's not necessarily a bad thing, because maybe it just goes to a different publisher who is the right home for that. And on the other hand, a book that comes in that's basically a proposal and some sample art pages, there is the potential there to maybe help shape that with the author. But then some authors, though they come in at that stage, they don't necessarily need that support in shaping it. Maybe they're going to move through to the final stages pretty much, with a clear vision anyway, and it's going to be small, kind of spelling and things like that they need, or production issues that need to be sort of taken care of. So every project really is different, and it's sort of hard to say, because every creator is different and how they want to approach it. The only thing I'd say is that, like, you don't have to come in with a finished piece of art. No one should have to feel that like they have to do it first for the publisher to take it on. It's sort of really the sort of things I'd generally be looking at is having a synopsis of whatever the story is, fiction or non-fiction, and having maybe a couple of script pages and having a couple of pages of sample art. Doesn't even have to be the art that's going to be the kind of final art for this project. It just needs to be sort of indicative of the kind of art that the creator can produce. So but then I wouldn't turn away something that was like basically finished and was like amazingly awesome and I loved it. So
cool. Maybe related to that, Sarah's got another question. Says, I run an NFP, the Abortion Project. I want to curate an anthology on abortion in Australia. Could you discuss the publishing process, e.g., do you pitch to creators first, or do you pitch to publishers first, or do you seek arts funding?
Yeah, it depends on so many things. Obviously, if you're sort of pitching an anthology, the publisher would be concerned about, like, can you deliver the authors that you say you're going to? You want to have, it doesn't have to be 100% fixed, but you want at least some idea about who's going to be in this book. And funding, I guess, depends on the nature of the project as well. Like, are you getting people who really need to be paid for their time? In which case, there's going to have to be some kind of book advances. Usually aren't huge. Certainly, even big ones, you really can't live off them. And so, you're usually talking about, like, getting something like Australia Council funding, or some sort of residency that can sort of give you time and space to sort of work on things. So in some cases people are going to need that. Other cases, maybe everyone is in on this project. It's sort of a passion project that everyone's kind of come together for, so maybe you don't need that. But, like, it sort of really depends on the project itself and the people that you're working with. But I guess the main thing is just to make sure when you're coming to the publisher, if you're saying you want to have some idea about who's going to be in it, and some sort of, I guess, guarantee that, like, about whether, about the fact that some of those people are going to stay in the project. And certainly a publisher doesn't want to get the feeling that, like, is there some kind of, exploitation going on here of someone in the process? But yeah, so it's sort of hard to say for sure, but, like, I'm guessing that probably it's a matter of, like, that's going to be pitching it to that the anthology editor is going to be pitching it to other people that they want to get involved in the process first, before they come pitching it to the publisher, to sort of get people on board.
Yeah, and I'd say in terms of the arts funding, I think it's interesting. I've found, anyway, from my work with GLOM, when you go for these art funding, you're talking about maybe OSCO or something like that. You're in usually a category with prose, like that's sometimes it's in a visual category, sometimes not. You're kind of sitting between the two, and sometimes the criteria fit for one, not the other. And I guess maybe I thought it might be interesting to talk a little bit about where Australian comics sit in terms of the Australian, like, the wider literary scene, and sort of your take on where, how they're perceived and where they're kind of headed, maybe.
Yeah, well, I think there is an extent to which they are not perceived, sadly. And I mean, at the moment, there are relatively few books coming out from sort of established publishers that have distribution, I suppose, into booksellers. So so part of that's, I guess, a little bit of a chicken and egg thing. But yeah, I think there is a kind of I think I alluded to it before, that a lot of people, they'll read comics when they're smaller. They'll read the Babysitters comics, Babysitters Club comics, or they'll read X-Men, or they'll read Asterix and Obelix, sort of comics. And then sort of at some point, you kind of like do Persepolis or Mouse for VCE, then that's kind of it. You're sort of done. And so I feel like people who sort of, I guess, take sort of art forms seriously on their own terms, often, like, even if they themselves are not really comics readers, will give it a lot of respect. And in that way, I guess it's a kind of a bit more like something like poetry or experimental writing or speculative fiction or something like that. But in terms of a wider audience, there's still a bit of a gap between building that sort of reinforcing sort of positive discussion about comics, where booksellers and newspaper editors and people on book shows on radio and TV are sort of talking about it, and the person on the streets talking about it. And I'm hoping as we get more more people sort of publishing comics, and I think there's been apart from Scribe, Alan and Unwin have been doing some more books this year, and other publishers doing one or two books here or there. As that sort of grows, and as they sort of get into things like we've seen things be nominated for onto the short lists of Premier's Awards, seeing things on the long list and short list of the Stellar Prize, which is a fantastic prize, and those kind of things. Just this week, Stellar Prize is going to do a session on comics. So that kind of advocacy, hopefully is sort of like everything that everyone is doing, kind of increases the network of kind of positive energy towards comics that makes them more of a real proposition. As like, oh yeah, these are books that everyone should be reading, which I think they should. But it's a very nascent market in Australia at the moment, and that's just a matter of just keep on chipping away at all those connections, and I think at every level, from the sort of grassroots to the big publishers like Alan and Unwin.
Yeah, I definitely find that things have changed a lot in the last few years in a positive direction, I would say, generally. I wondered, I kind of think like maybe to that sort of you were mentioning like the trajectory for most people in reading comics, and how it kind of ends usually in around the teens, and then maybe you dip back into an adult graphic novel like Mouse or something like that that's very weighty, and kind of belies its comics nature by being very adult. But I wonder if the proliferation of and this is a market that I'm not personally, like, I don't make young adult comics or publish them, but I wonder if like the young adult like comic market seems to be like really expanding, and if maybe that's going to kind of bridge the gap a little bit in terms of like people not dropping off, if we've got the like adult books, comics sort of there for them to like have this bridge too. I think that, to me, I'm feeling bullish about, I guess.
Yep, hope so.
Yeah. And I guess something else, we're into the last couple minutes, and people feel free to jump into the chat if you have any questions that you want to ask David. I might keep going and we'll see if any come, but just a warning that we've got a few more minutes. And I guess I wanted to ask you if there's anything happening in comics at the moment that you are particularly excited about in, maybe Australian comics, maybe comics internationally.
Well, there's lots of things. Just this week, there's a creator called Rumena Yi, who I think is she in Indonesia maybe? Has come out with this. Should have the. Do I have it? Oh, I should have had it handy, but no. She just came out with this comic book devices sort of catalog, which is just sort of trying to give a vocabulary to, like, when panels transition in this way within a comic, or when you do this with a speech balloon, or when you draw a figure in this way, give a name to that, and just to try and give some more vocabulary to everyone when they come to discussing comics. And I think that's a super exciting project, because I do love talking about comics, and and again, it's just I guess create a sort of grassroots effort to increase comic book literacy. Yeah, and then oh, I've got on my desk here, this is like this enormous book that's just come out from Allen and Unwin. Whoops, there's the camera. This enormous book that's just come out from Allen and Unwin this week, by Steve Mushin, I'm not sure. That just looks like this immense book to sort of fire people's imaginations. I think that's got a kind of I think it's put out through their children's division, though I think honestly it's a sort of crossover kind of book, and hopefully that will fire up a lot of people. Yeah, I know that there's the 2 new directors for the comic arts workshop, and it's just really fantastic to hear that that's ongoing, and going to continue sort of generating this new generations of creators, and more books that we're going to see in the future. Island magazine, sort of literary magazine based in Tasmania. The last 3 issues, and the next one they've been running a project for specifically to publish comics in their pages, which is like fantastic. We really a lot of the people sort of working, you sort of talked about Levi and others before. We published Tommy Parish, and a lot of people used to come out of The Lifted Brow, which did a lot of fantastic work in terms of publishing comics, and it's sort of sadly missed, but sort of great to see Island magazine, a more traditional literary magazine at the moment, sort of trying out comics, and some nice work there. I guess Ducks by Kate Beaton internationally. That's the book I feel like whenever I'm talking to people, it seems to be the book that keeps coming up, as a kind of I guess future Persepolis or something, kind of. But just an amazingly accomplished book that wears its talent very lightly, in a way where you sort of can read it and sort of feel like at times, oh, this is a very simply told comic, but sort of later on you sort of go, oh, how did she do that, and how does she tell this story? And the sort of richness that's actually there. It's an amazing book. I'm excited about the 2 books I've just sent to print, and the other 4 books that are coming up beyond that as well. So
can you say anything about those, or is it a little premature?
So next year we've got 12 rules for strife, which is Sam Woolman and Jeff Sparrow, a kind of handbook to not letting other people change the world for you, but making change in the world yourself. That is visually bold and exciting, and hopefully it's a little bit of a hand grenade into the sort of political conversations that people have, everything from like conversations in the Starbucks about like actually I think I should be paid more, up to like things like social justice and how do we maybe reorganize society. That's coming out in May next year. We've got The Islands Where We Left Our Ancestors by Joshua Sanders Burrito. So he was at that 2017 Comic Arts Workshop, and then subsequently he ran the Comic Arts Workshop until recently, so with Valerie Harris. And but yeah, his book is it's a sort of memoir of visiting these Italian islands with his parents, and his paternal line originated over there, and they're sort of searching for their roots, and particularly searching for the grave of his great grandfather, I think it is. I've probably gotten the wrong number of greats, but it's a beautiful, clever, funny sort of sort of lyrical sort of book. And yeah, that's coming out in July next year. And then we've got a third book coming out next year, which hasn't been announced yet, so I can't say anything about that. And another book coming out in 2025. I can't say anything about because it hasn't been announced yet, but hopefully shortly. And beyond that, we've got a book about the Brownout murders, which was this sort of serial killer in Melbourne in World War II. This thing that happened, but sort of this is for the perspective of like how did it affect these women in World War II who were suddenly working in factories, having all these freedoms that they never had before, as all the men have gone overseas, and then sort of cursed with this sort of serial killer bringing terror to the streets, and also this book of sort of nonfiction social science, The Town Without Television, which was about this social scientist in Canada who discovered this town in the Rockies that had not received television when the rest of the world happened. And so even though social scientists had been unable to sort of really measure the impacts of television because it happened so quickly, all of a sudden she had this opportunity, that towers were going to be built in 3 years' time, and they could do before and after experiments. How does television actually affect you? So that's going to be great as well.
Yeah, cool. Well, thanks so much, David. I think we're right on 7, so we might leave it there, and a good place to end on. So thanks, everybody, for coming along, submitting questions. And thank you so much, David, for coming and being so generous in your talk and having things to show us. I loved seeing the mock fold out. Amazing. I hope you have like an ephemera pile of these like print tests somewhere. Just a reminder, this session will be available on YouTube as a resource, and it'll be captioned in the coming days if you want to revisit the conversation. And please join us tomorrow. I'm going to sit down with comic artist and educator Meg O'Shea to discuss kind of the craft side of making comics, and in particular graphic autobiography. We'll be running that 6 to 7, same place, same time, on the Express Media YouTube. Thanks, everybody. Have a good rest of your night.